I've spent the last 6 weeks buried in after-action reports, supply logs, veteran oral histories, and the institutional records of the Australian Army Catering Corps. When I first came across the diary entries from one company, AACC, dated June 1966. Clinical, bureaucratic language describing bread shipments arriving from Saigon, so riddled with mold that 100 pounds had to be condemned on the runway at Nui Dat. I thought I'd stumbled onto a supply chain story, a logistics curiosity. I almost moved on. I didn't. And the more I dug, the more I understood that what I was looking at wasn't a story about bread at all. It was a story about what separates armies that understand human beings from armies that understand logistics. Those are not always the same thing. What I found stopped me cold more than once. I think it'll stop you too. Nui Dat, Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. June 25th, 1966. The resupply helicopter drops out of a white tropical sky and settles into the dust of the 1st Australian Task Force base. The rotor wash flattens the scrub grass, kicks red dirt into the eyes of the soldiers waiting on the pad. They've been out in the jungle for 16 days. 16 days of hexamine tablets and tinned meat. 16 days of darkness, ambushes, soaking monsoon rain, and the particular psychological weight of listening for sounds that might kill you. The helicopter brings ammunition. It brings water. And because of the ingenuity of one army cook working over an improvised oven built from a 44-gallon drum, it also brings something that none of the military planners in Canberra, and certainly none in Washington, had thought to put in any field manual. Fresh bread rolls, filled with cold meat and salad. What happened next, according to every account I could find from veterans of that period, is that the first thing those soldiers did, before checking their equipment, before writing letters home, before doing almost anything else, was walk past the kitchen, past the man they called the bait layer. They gave him some cheerful obscenity, the way soldiers do, and then they thanked him, actually thanked him. That detail shouldn't be surprising, but when you place it next to what was happening 15 kilometers away at American bases across 3rd Corps, where G were opening pre-packaged cans with dates stamped in the early 1950s, eating cold ham and lima beans out of a tin and dropping the empties into a sock to muffle the noise on patrol, it starts to look like something else entirely. It starts to look like a strategic advantage hiding in plain sight. The Americans had the greatest military-industrial machine in history. They had the Red Ball Express. They had the logistical infrastructure of a continental superpower projected halfway around the world. And they had pre-packaged C-rations that tasted, by most accounts, exactly like what they were. Food engineered for the shelf, not for the soldier. The Australians had a 44-gallon drum and a cook who knew how to use it. This is the story of what happened when two armies went to war in the same jungle, ate completely different food, and produced completely different results. And why almost nobody has talked about what that difference actually meant. When I started reading through the American military's own assessments of its field ration program, I kept expecting to find confidence. Justifiable confidence, even. The United States in 1965 was the greatest manufacturing nation on Earth. If it could produce 500,000 men for Vietnam, it could surely produce acceptable food for them. And on paper, that confidence was warranted. The meal, combat individual, officially replacing the old C-ration designation from 1958, though soldiers universally kept calling it C-rats, was a genuine logistical achievement. 12 different menus, pre-cooked components that could be eaten hot or cold, caloric targets of roughly 1,200 calories per meal, designed to sustain a man in the field. The system could feed hundreds of thousands of troops across a theater of war simultaneously. That's not a small thing. American military planners in the early 1960s looked at their ration system and saw efficiency, standardization, proven industrial scale. What they missed, and what I found documented in report after I started pulling on this thread, is that efficiency and sustenance are not the same thing as morale. And in a counterinsurgency fought in crushing jungle heat over months and years, morale is not a soft consideration. It is a tactical reality. The Australian Army took a different view. I found it stated plainly in the institutional history of the Australian Army Catering Corps, which was established as a proper professional corps in 1943 and had been evolving ever since. The principle that runs through every document I examined was deceptively simple. Feeding the soldier is a commander's responsibility, not a logistics responsibility, a commander's responsibility. The distinction matters. It means that food is understood at the level of doctrine as something that affects fighting capacity, something that commanders are accountable for, the way they are accountable for ammunition or medical readiness. The American system understood food as a supply problem. The Australian system understood it as a leadership problem. In the early 1960s, the AACC had undergone what I can only describe as a quiet revolution. Television had arrived in Australian homes, and with it, a shift in cultural attitudes toward cooking. Soldiers who enlisted wanting to become cooks were now, for the first time, often actually skilled. National service, reintroduced in the mid-1960s, brought a wave of men into the AACC who had completed formal culinary apprenticeships. The corps that would deploy to Vietnam was not the same corps that had served in Korea. It was better educated, better motivated, and, critically, more resourceful. When American military advisors surveyed the situation at Nui Dat in 1966 and saw Australian cooks working out of improvised field kitchens with limited refrigeration, intermittent supply, and equipment cobbled together from whatever was available, the prevailing assumption was clear enough. This was a small army with a small army's limitations. The Americans had the infrastructure. The Americans had the system. Reading through those early assessments, I kept thinking. They were right about the infrastructure. They were wrong about everything else. To understand what the Australian cooks actually built at Nui Dat, you need to understand the problem they were handed when they arrived. The first Australian task force established its base in Phuoc Tuy province in April 1966. From the beginning, Australian forces were plugged into the American logistical system, which meant in practice that their food supply was predominantly American. This created an immediate tension. American rations were designed for American palates. Certain items were simply not part of Australian military culture or Australian cultural identity. And in the specific psychological context of Vietnam, away from home, in an alien and hostile environment, the connection between food and identity was not trivial. I found the earliest evidence of this tension in the One Company AACC supply diaries from 1966. And the detail that grabbed me was not the broad supply failures, but the specific one. Bread. Fresh bread, that most fundamental of foods, turned out to be the canary in the coal mine. The entries are worth knowing in sequence. On May 18, 1966, the diary records, bread received from Saigon found to be inedible. On June 24, 1966, a bread shipment arrives very moldy, 50% condemned as unfit for human consumption. The following day, another shipment flies forward to Nui Dat, 100 pounds condemned on inspection. This was not a one-off failure. It was a systemic one. The American supply chain, built for a massive force with different priorities and different standards, was producing bread that Australian supply officers refused to accept. Not because they were being precious, because it was, literally, inedible. The response from the Australians at Nui Dat was not to file more complaints. The 5th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 5 RAR, formally requisitioned a supply of yeast from one company, AACC. Their unit cooks were going to bake bread themselves, at Nui Dat, in a war zone. This was the beginning of something. The Australian Army Catering Corps cooks in Vietnam, working under conditions that would challenge a civilian chef in a well-equipped kitchen, began fashioning ovens from 44-gallon drums. The same drums that held fuel and water were cut, modified, and converted into baking chambers capable of producing actual loaves of bread in the tropical heat of Phuoc Tuy province. They designed and built bain-maries to keep food at serving temperature. They worked with whatever the supply system sent them. And they also worked the supply system itself, leveraging Australian-specific supply lines that ran independently of the American network. Because Australia, unlike its larger ally, had established a dedicated logistical pipeline running from the Australian mainland directly to Nui Dat, RAAF C-130 courier flights, landing ship mediums of the 32nd Small Ship Squadron, and commercial cargo vessels delivered items that simply weren't on the American supply manifest. Frozen lamb and beef, frozen chickens, Australian sausages, Vegemite, Australian jam and honey, butter, tomato sauce, and Worcestershire sauce. At one point, and I had to read this twice when I found it, live cattle were loaded onto RAAF Caribou transport aircraft and flown to Vietnam to be slaughtered for fresh meat. The AACC was building in the middle of a guerrilla war, something that the American system had essentially decided was impossible. A genuine field catering operation producing fresh food for its soldiers on a consistent basis. Meanwhile, the American approach had calcified around a system that its own evaluators acknowledged was designed for infrequent or short-term use, and was being used as the permanent daily diet for hundreds of thousands of men across multiple years. The C-ration and its formal replacement, the meal, combat, individual, had 12 menu varieties. They were pre-cooked and pre-packaged in heavy cans, each meal weighing approximately 1.63 pounds, each day's supply adding nearly 5 pounds to a soldier's load. In a jungle war where troops patrolled on foot for days at a stretch, where silence could be the difference between ambush and survival, soldiers were discovered stuffing their ration cans into socks simply to reduce the rattling noise they made on patrol. And some of those cans, Marine veterans in 1968 would note, bore production dates from the early 1950s. Surplus stocks from the Korean War era were still being issued in Vietnam. The moment that crystallized everything for me in my research came not from a battle report or a tactical assessment. It came from a simple operational pattern that I pieced together across multiple accounts, veteran testimonials, and the AACC's own institutional history. Every time a resupply helicopter lifted off from Nui Dat, carrying ammunition, carrying water, carrying the spare parts and medical supplies that kept the task force operational, Australian cooks made a decision. They used the resupply window not just to send material to the men in the field, they sent food, fresh food, specifically cold meat and salad bread rolls, freshly baked and assembled by men working at improvised field kitchens behind the wire. Think about what this required. The cook had to anticipate the resupply schedule, bake bread that morning, prepare the fillings, package the rolls in time for them to go out on the helicopter, and do all of this while also maintaining the base kitchen and managing whatever other food production was required for troops not currently in the field. It was not in any field manual that I could find. It was not a doctrinal requirement. It was ingenuity. It was pride in craft. And it was, in a very specific way, a form of combat service. The veterans' accounts of what happened when those rolls arrived in the field are consistent enough to be striking. Men who had been on patrol for a week or more, subsisting on tinned rations heated over hexamine tablets, sleeping in ambush positions, moving through jungle that tried to kill them in a dozen different ways. received fresh bread. In the jungle, in Vietnam, a 2RAR/NZ ANZAC Battalion After Action narrative describes troops on Operation Ainsley in Phuoc Tuy Province receiving fresh food after 16 days on canned rations. The account records that it was a welcome change. That understates it. The morale calculus is difficult to quantify, but I found one veteran's summary that captures it better than any official document. Peter Collis, who served in Vietnam and later became deputy president of the RSLACT branch, put it plainly. The important things were to come home and have a shower, have a beer, and a fresh meal cooked by someone else. It increased morale. 3 things: a shower, a beer, a fresh meal. On the American side of the wire, the experience was radically different. The meal, combat, individual, the MCI, still called C-rats by everyone who ate them, was the daily reality for most American infantry in the field. The system had been designed as a short-term solution for combat conditions where A rations, fresh food prepared in a mess hall, were unavailable. In Vietnam, for many units, it became the permanent condition. The consequences were psychological as much as nutritional. Soldiers developed a kind of dark taxonomy of MCI components. The pound cake and canned pears were valued enough to be traded as currency. The ham and lima beans, known throughout the force by a profane nickname I won't repeat here, though every Vietnam veteran I've read knows exactly which one, were so reviled that they persisted in the supply system despite unanimous negative field reports across the Korean and Vietnam wars. By all accounts, Army planners kept issuing them anyway. The improvisation that American soldiers invented to cope is, in its own way, a tribute to human resilience. Officers traded captured enemy weapons and gear with rear echelon personnel for boxes of frozen steaks and fresh fruit. The McElhenney Company sent hundreds of thousands of small Tabasco sauce bottles to Vietnam with a C-ration cookbook, and it became one of the most effective morale initiatives of the war. Not because of what the military did, but because a private company understood something the military hadn't: that food matters beyond its caloric value. And through all of this, the Australian approach, smaller scale, yes, operating without the American system's industrial reach, was producing something qualitatively different. Not perfect. The ration packs used by Australian troops on patrol were themselves the subject of consistent complaints. Nobody was pretending that freeze-dried tinned omelet was a satisfying meal. But when diggers came off operations, they came back to Nui Dat and they went straight to the kitchen, gave the bait layer some stick, thanked him genuinely, and ate fresh food. The institutional history of the AACC records this without fanfare. The first stop for the diggers on their return from ops was to go past the kitchen, give some rude comment to the bait layer, and thank them for the food. And then, in a line that stayed with me long after I finished reading it, it notes that there were many complaints about Vietnam in general, which was natural, but that the only real complaints about food in Vietnam had been about the ration packs. Not the base food, not the cook's output, just the field rations, which even the Australians couldn't fix from a 44-gallon drum oven at Nui Dat. That asymmetry is significant. The Americans had the system, the Australians had the cooks, and the cooks won. As the war continued and Australian forces settled into their operational rhythm in Phuoc Tuy Province, the AACC's field catering capability evolved in ways that the initial planners hadn't anticipated, and in some cases hadn't authorized. The problem of bread remained central. I traced it through 1966 and 1967 in the supply diaries. The repeated failures of the American-sourced bread deliveries, the condemnation of shipments, the formal and informal workarounds that Australian units developed. What began as 5 RARs requisitioned for yeast spread laterally through the task force as other units recognized the model and adopted it. Cooks who had trained in civilian kitchens before national service, many of them with formal apprenticeship credentials in baking, applied skills they had brought with them from Australia and produced results that should, strictly speaking, have been impossible in the conditions they were working under. The 44-gallon drum ovens improved. Techniques were shared between units. Baking schedules were synchronized with resupply windows to ensure that fresh bread reached men in the field while it was still edible, which, in tropical heat and humidity, meant getting it there quickly. The bain-maries that kept prepared food at serving temperature were refined through trial and error into systems that actually worked reliably in conditions of intermittent power and extreme heat. On the supply side, the Australian logistical pipeline from the mainland was increasingly tailored to what the AACC cooks actually needed. The Vegemite was not incidental. Every account I found from Australian veterans mentions it. Not because it's an unusual food, but because in the context of Vietnam, where almost everything else was foreign or strange or hostile, that small tube of yeast extract tasted like home. Australian jam, Australian honey, Australian butter. These items had no military justification beyond morale, and the Australian system provided them anyway. Because the people who designed the system understood that morale had a military justification even when jam did not. I want to be honest about the American response, because it wasn't nothing. American units, particularly those with resourceful logistics officers, found creative ways to improve on the MCI baseline. One account from a 1st Cavalry Division company commander describes his unit's supply officer trading captured enemy weapons for frozen steaks and fresh fruit. Off the books, entirely unauthorized, and completely effective. The same officer, apparently, acquired what the account describes as a pallet-mounted diesel ice cream plant of uncertain provenance, flew fresh ice cream out to rifle companies in the field, and produced a morale spike that the narrator describes without any apparent embarrassment about the source of the equipment. No one questioned the source, the account notes. Morale spiked. These improvisations are a testament to American ingenuity, but they are also evidence of the system's failure. When the official supply chain can't produce acceptable food, and solving the problem requires a logistics officer to trade combat souvenirs for steaks, the system is not working. The Australians were improvising too, but they were improvising within a framework that understood fresh food as a legitimate military requirement. The Americans were improvising against a system that classified it as a luxury. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, for context, operated under conditions that made both American and Australian feeding look lavish. VC combatants subsisted primarily on rice, with meat a genuine rarity. They foraged cassava and sweet potatoes and fished from local waterways. They sometimes captured American C-rations and ate them. Evidence that even the MCI, universally derided by American troops, was better than what the enemy was eating. This context matters. The comparison here is not between armies well-fed and armies starving. It is between two allied armies with access to significant resources, whose fundamentally different philosophies about food produced measurably different results for the men eating it. By 1967 and 1968, as Australian forces in Phuoc Tuy province settled into their sustained counterinsurgency campaign, the AACC field kitchens at Nui Dat had reached what I can only describe as a kind of operational maturity. The improvised had become routine. The 44-gallon drum ovens were producing bread reliably enough that fresh rolls on resupply choppers had stopped being a pleasant surprise and started being expected. Cooks had a name: bait layers, a term that manages to be simultaneously affectionate and insulting in the way that only soldiers' nicknames can be. And that name carried a specific institutional weight at Nui Dat. The kitchen, run by Sergeant John Saxby of C Company 7 RAR at Fire Support Base the Horseshoe in 1967, was typical enough to be telling. By that point, units across the task force had given their kitchens informal names. Sergeant Sax's Dewdrop Inn was hardly unique. These were not mess halls in the conventional sense. They were improvised cooking operations in a combat zone, run by men who had learned to make fresh food in conditions that offered them almost no material support beyond what they could build themselves. The contrast with the American system at its peak deployment was stark. By 1968, there were more than 500,000 American military personnel in Vietnam. The logistics required to supply them dwarfed anything the Australians could imagine. And yet the food that reached the majority of those men in the field, the sea rats, the MCs, the cans of ham and lima beans that dated in some cases to the Korean War, remained the same system that had been producing complaints since World War II. The Army's own post-war evaluations acknowledged that the ration had been designed for infrequent or short-term use and had been used continuously for years. Studies conducted in the late 1970s, examining why the replacement program was so urgent, noted that poor quality rations had contributed to morale problems among conscripts significant enough to be connected, in some analyses, to the drug use crisis that afflicted American forces in Vietnam. That is not a peripheral finding. That is a direct line from food quality to combat effectiveness. The Australians at Nui Dat were not immune to morale problems. No army in Vietnam was. But the specific vector of food, the daily, grinding demoralization of eating cold tinned food that tasted like it had been packed for a different war, was substantially mitigated by men who had built ovens from oil drums and who considered fresh bread for soldiers in the field to be a professional obligation rather than an exceptional luxury. One account from an American veteran who encountered Australian catering at a combined operation captures the gap in a single anecdote. Moving through an Australian position, he and his squad were fed a hot meal, actual fresh food prepared at a field kitchen, and his recollection of the experience centers not on the food itself, but on his inability to process it as normal. He had been in Vietnam long enough that fresh, hot food prepared by someone else felt genuinely extraordinary. For the diggers around him, it was Tuesday. The AACC's institutional history records that the only consistent complaints from Australian soldiers about food in Vietnam concerned the ration packs, the field rations used on patrol, which were a compromise both armies had to make for mobile operations. The base food, the food produced by the bait layers at Nui Dat and the forward fire support bases, drew consistent appreciation and almost no documented complaints. In the broader landscape of Vietnam veteran testimony, which contains complaints about almost everything, that absence is meaningful. I've spent a lot of time with this story, and the thing that stays with me most is not the 44-gallon drum ovens or the helicopter bread rolls, remarkable as both of those things are. It's the underlying philosophy that produced them. The Australian Army's approach to feeding its soldiers in Vietnam operated from a premise that the American system, for all its industrial scale, had lost somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery. That soldiers are human beings whose psychological state is a legitimate military variable. And that food, real food, food that tastes like home, food that someone made for you, is one of the most effective tools available for managing that variable. The post-war period largely vindicated this view. The American military, in the late 1970s, spent enormous resources developing the meal ready to eat to replace the MCI. A decades-late acknowledgement that the C-ration system had failed on its own terms. The MRE itself underwent continuous revision for another 2 decades as the military slowly learned what the Australians had been applying in practice at Nui Dat. That soldiers who don't look forward to eating will eventually not eat adequately, and soldiers who don't eat adequately don't fight as well. The AACC itself underwent transformations in the post-Vietnam era. Commercialization pressures reduced its numbers significantly in the 1990s, a decision that many veterans viewed as a misunderstanding of exactly the lesson Vietnam had demonstrated. The course was eventually disbanded in 2010, though its functions continued. The broader lesson, for Iraq, for Afghanistan, for whatever comes next, is not that armies should prioritize comfort over capability. It's that the distinction between the two is often false. In a counterinsurgency campaign sustained over years, in conditions of physical and psychological stress that civilians cannot fully imagine, the accumulated weight of daily human experiences shapes the character of the force. Food is not separate from that. It is central to it. Peter Collis, the Vietnam veteran who listed a fresh meal as one of the three things that mattered most after coming in from operations, framed it as simply as it can be framed. It increased morale. Not complicated, not theoretical, just true. When I think about those AACC cooks at Nui Dat, men working over drum ovens in tropical heat, timing their bread production to the resupply helicopter schedule so that soldiers 16 days into a jungle patrol might receive a fresh roll, I think about what that act of craft and care actually communicated to the men who received it. Not just, here is food, but someone thought about you. Someone planned for you. Someone here understands that you are a person and not just a weapon system in the jungle. That is what the Americans, with all their industrial might, consistently failed to deliver. And that, in the end, is what the Australians consistently did. The bread mattered. But the reason the bread mattered is the thing that matters most.